I totally forgot to do the one that has the bumper, but
That's fine. How's it going?
we are live. It's going good. It is a busy time for us here at Reclaim right now. We've got, I mean, Pilot and I just did a workshop for a school. And next week we've got our admin workshop for the fall. And it's pretty cool because we've even had people, it's just 2 days away. Well, 2 business days, I
It's on
guess.
Tuesday. Today's Friday.
Yeah. And it's cool. We're still having people sign up like even today, which is great. And honestly, it's an online workshop, so that totally works.
Hmm.
It's been great. But we're kind of in the midst of prepping for that. I am currently in the midst of packing up my life and selling my house because we just bought a new house, which is super exciting. It is a busy time, but all in good ways. And the week after, we're gonna be Pilot and I will actually be at
Open Ed
OpenEd
24.
24. So yeah. So by the way, I should say, so the topic of this stream today, which required me to sit down and think about like procedure and technical stuff and how people can learn information and a little bit of pedagogy, or technically I guess there's the word we use pedagogy, but when you're talking about adults, there's a different word that you almost never hear people actually use. Anyway, was maybe not the smartest move on my point, because this is a stream where I want to kind of talk about Docker
Hmm.
and my take on one way to learn it, or one way to learn parts of it. Where obviously there's a lot of things to know about Docker, and there's a lot of prerequisites to know or to be comfortable with Docker, which is sort of why I think it is hard to look at and be like, I understand what this is and what it's for, because if you don't know, if you're not comfortable with the command line or comfortable with like Linux, a lot of this won't make sense. We're going to do this today in a way that I think you won't have to know much of those things. I'm going to explain what you need as we do it, but I hope it'll be useful for a type of person to sort of understand why this technology gets used so much nowadays.
Hmm.
That's kind of my objective here, and show a little bit about under the hood of like how things work, not necessarily on like a technical level. Like we're not going to be looking at like specs and file systems and in computer science, but we are going to look at sort of the code underneath things that you may run in Docker and kind of what that looks like. So, you
Yeah, I
know,
was I was just going
sorry.
to say that I part of the reason that I asked to sit in on this, and I personally feel I'll make a great co-host for this because I don't understand Docker. I've tried multiple times to uh, sort of figure out how to make containers do anything like that, and every time I sort of get partway through and then I go, I've hit an error. This isn't working. I think my most recent attempt, I managed to get all the way through to starting it spinning up, and then I left it alone to run while I was gone over the weekend. And when I came back on Monday, it said this spent too long running and it crashed, and you can't do it anymore.
Yeah. So, and we're not going to go through everything one may need to know
Hmm.
front to back, but what I want to cover today is, I think, an essential pieces of information that often get missed. Certainly were missed for me when I was
Hmm.
learning about this stuff, that would have helped me in learning how to run services in Docker, right? Because for me, and I think you and Shannon's in Discord right now, probably Shannon too, the goal is to do something, run something with Docker. But there
Hmm.
are other goals. There are other reasons why people may use Docker. Another goal that's similar but not exactly the same is you're a developer and you want to ship your code in Docker so it's easy for other people to run. We are
Hmm.
going to kind of show both a little bit. And I don't want to make too big of a deal of this because, to be perfectly honest, this is something I'm going to take a stab at today on the stream, and it may not be perfect, right? So I've got some notes, but what I'm hoping is that this is something we can build on.
Hmm.
Pilot and I were talking about like it would be kind of cool to have like a playlist of resources on Docker that we could point to, and we've done a lot on it. And this is one thing that I think is maybe missing, and that's sort of the why and the beginnings of the how. So I'm going to stop talking philosophically, and we're going to dig into it because it's time. We've talked for 5 minutes, and so let's dig in. So
Let's roll.
yeah. So I'm going to pull up Reclaim Cloud here. So of course we'll use Reclaim Cloud. Most of the things we're going to do today, you could run on your own computer. I'm not going to cover that, mostly because I don't run Docker on my own computer very often. And most of the things are for the end goal of running something other people can access. So usually you want to do that on a cloud service. Of course, we're going to show Reclaim Cloud here. And it's a pretty simple way to do it. So I'm actually going to go to the marketplace, and I'm going to make a new Docker Engine container. And it really doesn't actually matter what I name this because it's not going to exist that long. It's going to be a temporary space for us. But I'm going to let that install here while I do yet a little bit more preamble. So again, the why and the beginnings of the how. So why? Docker, or not why, but more what is Docker, I suppose. Docker is containers, and containers are a specific way to isolate processes and run software on a computer. Most often with Docker, we're talking about running stuff that works on Linux. That's not always true, but is almost always true.
I mean, what doesn't work on Linux?
Well, what I mean is there are ways to run software for things that don't work on Linux. So like on Windows, you can run Windows containers in Docker, but I don't know that world, and it is not mostly what people use Docker for. Most people use Docker even on Windows to run Linux software. So that's kind of the great thing is the whole idea is Docker gives you a way to use containers to package up something that should run on any computer pretty much that runs Docker. So I can run this, software that is a web app on Reclaim Cloud, but I also could run it on my Mac for maybe development purposes or testing purposes. I also could run it on a Windows server. Not sure why you would want to, but maybe you're more comfortable in that world, or that's what you just have access to.
And you don't have to make big changes to ensure compatibility.
Yes. So that is one of the core reasons that Docker exists. And it uses containers, which is a whole technical thing that I'm not going to go into that, but basically containers are
microservers.
Kind of. And if you're familiar with virtual machines, that is emulating sort of a entire computer, including like its boot process and operating system and kernel, which is sort of how it interfaces with hardware. And containers are sort of a lighter weight version of that don't emulate all parts of the machine. They basically just isolate so that you can take a big computer and run individual containers that have their own little programs going on, and they can't interact with other containers in a safe, from like a security standpoint. This is how Reclaim Cloud works. Technically, it's, of course, as is always the case, much more complicated than that. But for really my purposes, and I dig into this stuff all the time, that's about all that's important to know most of the time. So we've got a Docker environment here, and all that means in Reclaim Cloud is we have a container. To complicate this further, of course, we're going to run containers in a container, but put that out of your mind for a second. We have an environment where Docker is already installed. If you don't have Docker already installed, saying you're doing this on your local machine, go to the Docker website. There's installation instructions. It's not super hard to install. Anyway, we're going to do everything here from the terminal, just because we're going to need to do some terminal stuff. But I'm also going to edit text from the terminal. I'm going to say that really for purposes of making it faster for me. But if you're wanting to like follow along with this, you could always use the config panel to get a more like a GUI text editor. I'm also going to use the Vim text editor at the command line because that's what I'm fastest with. But you could use Nano is a great alternative too if you've not learned Vim, because Vim is a little bit weird to get started with. And Nano is going to edit text just as good. It's all text at the end. So I am in sort of our home folder here. I'm actually going to make a folder just to play around with. So we're gonna make a folder. We'll call it Docker. And excuse me while I rearrange some windows here, which you can't really see that I'm doing that.
No, because it's not visible.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to change directory into there. So a few things. The fundamental thing, in my opinion, that you can do with Docker is you can make a new Docker container. And every Docker container is based on something. There are really low level containers, the deep lore that I don't know, honestly. But most of the time, the most basic container that you're going to run in Docker is based on a Linux distribution, which is just a spin on Linux. We won't go all into it, of course. This could be its own tangent, but Linux itself is a kernel, which is to say a program that tells a computer how to interface with hardware. It's not actually an operating system. So Linux is the kernel, and then there's software on top of the kernel that is kind of what we know, like the terminal, and in this case, like Bash is the shell that we're going to use, which is the interactive environment that we can type on, and a million other programs, right? Your computer is made up of a lot of programs, and that includes servers too. So I've already lost my train of thought here a little bit, but what I'm saying is there is no like basic Linux. There is distributions of Linux that have the kernel, which is Linux, and other software on top of it. Many of them look and operate very similar. Here at Reclaim, and most companies, honestly, that are running servers, we use two main ones, but there are some others too. We use Ubuntu for a lot of stuff, and it's incredibly popular. And we use Alma Linux, which is sort of a offshoot of Red Hat Linux, which is a commercially supported version of Linux that is incredible. It is sort of the server standard, maybe even more so than Ubuntu. It's been around a lot longer too. Interesting now, Red Hat is actually developed by a company that got bought by IBM. So it's now that Red Hat is IBM. Alma Linux is a fork of that. Anyway, so we need to start with the distribution. And the cool thing about Docker is we can just, because people can make containers and push them to a central repository. Think of it like GitHub, but for containers. We can just download one and enter it, and now we're in a new sort of temporary system to operate in. So to show this as an example, we are in this environment, and of course it has Docker installed. It's also going to have, like, for example, well, I could install software in here, but I can also use Docker to basically temporarily enter a different distribution of Linux, which may have whatever software I'm looking for. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use Docker run. I'm going to give it a flag of an argument of -it, which means interactive.
Okay.
So let me stay in this environment and type things and use it. And then Debian. And Debian is a different Linux distribution. It's kind of like Ubuntu. Actually, Ubuntu is based off of it. And what this is going to do is it's going to go get the Debian Docker container, and now I'm in it. I'm in a completely different, technically, a completely different operating system inside of my other one. And we'll get to why, because that is a core thing here. That'll become more evident as we do more. But we can do a lot of the same things that we would normally do. So on Debian, we can use the apt command to install software. So I'm going to do apt update, which is going to like refresh its catalog of what software is available. And Actually, for now, you know what? Let's just install something like NeoFetch, and this is a program that.
I did think you were going to say Neopets for a minute. And I was like, I don't know if you know. That's not really. But no, this makes more sense.
NeoFetch is a program that gives you information about the operating system you're running.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Oops, I didn't type the command right. apt install NeoFetch. And then I'm going to give it a -y, which just says answer yes to the next question. And the next question is going to be, are you sure you want to install that? So it just saves me some time.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of time, but
I think it saves you 1 keystroke, maybe less.
It literally 2, because I have to hit enter. It'll be more clear why I did that later. I'm building to something, but
Okay.
So I installed NeoFetch. There was a bunch of dependencies, and let me try and run it and see what it does. Great. So I ran it, and this is the Debian logo made out of ASCII text.
I'm suddenly a huge fan. On board all the way.
Yeah, NeoFetch is cool. And actually, unfortunately, NeoFetch is now no longer maintained, but they're all alternatives.
Oh, no.
Yeah, there's the main alternative is FastFetch. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
There's not really like a security reason why it would be bad, because this is all NeoFetch really does, is you can just run it and get this little fancy display.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the kernel version we're running. You can see how many packages are installed. You can see our shell, which is bash. Interestingly, it actually passes through some information about the CPU, and this is not really correct, but that is a result of the way Reclaim Cloud works. It doesn't matter, but yeah, that's kind of interesting. And then it shows you some colors, which are just to test if your terminal's color emulation is working. So, so let me exit out of here. So I'm going to exit out, and now I'm out of that Docker container. If I try and run NeoFetch, it's not going to work because I'm not in there anymore, right?
Mm-hmm. Does the Debian environment still exist somewhere inside, or is it gone?
We're getting there, yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
I was going to say, what do you think? So if I run that same command I did before to enter Debian, if I run it, it's actually cached. So it was really fast. You remember last time I had to download something?
Oh, yeah.
It didn't take a long time, to be clear, but
It doesn't have to do that again.
Yeah. Let me try running NeoFetch again, because we installed it before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's not there. So this is the other thing that Docker, that's important about how Docker works, and it's sort of a blessing and a curse. Honestly, mostly a blessing. But Docker does not save anything you do unless you ask it to. So you may be like, why would you want that? And what this allows for, but what this allows for is by always returning to sort of a state of 0 inside of your containers, you can be assured that you're running the same configuration as someone else in the ways where it matters. So what this means is Docker containers are essentially a set of rules in some way, and then you commit them to a repository so that other people can get to that same state that you're at too. So let's say I wanted to make a container that used Debian, and all it did was install NeoFetch and run NeoFetch.
I was going to say, so you would have to, if it's a set of rules to make sure everyone has the same specs in their environment,
same configuration. Yeah.
You have to say, I would like a Debian with NeoFetch, please.
Yeah, so you can't just, it doesn't just exist. You have to provide a set of instructions to Docker, which tells it this is how my container should work from the starting point of an empty Debian container in this case. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to exit here, and we're going to do just that. Because what did I do to install Debian? I did an apt update to get a list of software. This is just refreshing Debian's cache, so it knows what software exists. Then I ran apt install -y, so it didn't ask me any more questions. NeoFetch. And I waited a little bit for it to do that.
It feels like a million years the second time around.
Then I ran NeoFetch. Those are the 3 things that I did. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make what's called a Docker file to do that in essentially 1 step. So Docker files are kind of, in some ways, the core of what Docker is, and in terms of how we use it. And this is a horrible web page to get into if you don't know anything about Docker files. But this is sort of a reference that shows every possible thing a Docker file can do.
I think I recognize this page, but I don't recognize anything on it.
The problem is it doesn't tell you what this is or why you'd use it.
Yep.
And to be fair, I'm sure they have a different part of their documentation that does that, maybe. But that's okay. We're going to talk about that right now. So I'm in my folder called Docker, right? I'm going to make a new file called Dockerfile. So I'm going to use my text editor. It's just going to be Dockerfile with a capital D. I'm not sure that the capitalization matters in this case, but usually capitalization does matter on Linux.
Does
we're
it
going to
have
provide it a set of instructions.
Does it have to be named Dockerfile?
It does if I want to make my life simpler. So
Okay.
We're going to run some commands later to execute the Docker file. And if I name it something different, I have to tell it what the name is. In this case, because I named it just Dockerfile, it's going to assume and use this.
It'll look for something called Dockerfile,
and it will run it.
Okay.
And the cool thing about that too is that also becomes a convention. So if you're, say, sharing a Docker file with someone on GitHub, they know what it is based on the name. You know, oh, that's a Docker file. I know because it's called Dockerfile. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say, give me Debian, update your software cache, install NeoFetch, run NeoFetch. We're gonna do all of that in a Docker file. So we are going to start with a from command, which tells it what container to start from.
Okay.
Right? Because I didn't create the Debian container. It exists out there. I'm just merely running it. Then I'm going to run a command. So I'm going to use the run command. And I am going to run apt update because that's what I did. And I'm going to do another one where I install NeoFetch.
Did you say what apt stands for?
I don't remember what apt stands for.
That's fine. Don't worry about it.
If you want to in a different window, Google it.
I'll go Google it and you do this.
It stands for something. It's probably like something package transmission. I don't know. Is my guess.
Advanced package tool.
Okay.
Maybe.
Sure.
Maybe.
A lot of apt is one of the oldest package managers, and because other Linux distributions use different ones. For instance, Red Hat and Alma Linux they actually have two, probably more than two. I don't know, two that I know of, Yum or DNF. I don't know what either of those stand for. I'm sure Yum is some like backronym, honestly.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm not sure why my terminal is all highlighted like this. That's weird. We'll fix that later. Anyway, so I'm gonna do an apt update and an apt install NeoFetch -y. And now this y is now important because I'm not actually going to be able to interact and like type things in because this is all happening in a script, which is the Docker file. Then we're going to tell Docker, okay, cool. Once you do those things, here is the command I want you to run by default in this container, unless the user specifies something else. So most often you end a Docker file with that. And it's very similar to run where you can just type in a command here. But this one's command, cmd. And we're going to run NeoFetch. So I'm going to write out that file and exit here. And I'm actually going to close my terminal because of all the weird highlighting shenanigans that are happening.
But it's going to keep it. We're going to be okay.
Yeah, it's okay. So I've got my Docker file in here, right? So now I am going to build this image, and then I'm going to run it. So I'm going to do Docker build. I have to do, to make my life easier, basically, I have to do -t, which stands for tag. And this lets me give it a name so I can run it later, basically. Otherwise, I have to run it by some like random string it generates, which is no fun. So
I do remember that. I remember how terrible those strings are.
Yeah, and I mean you can copy it, right? But just do -t and give it a name. Like never. There's really not a great reason to do anything else when you're exploring like I am here. Let's give this a tag of Neofetch. How about that?
That's not going to cause any confusions or conflicts because that's also
in maybe yours and mine brain, but
okay.
not for
but
Docker.
Not from a technical perspective. That's fine.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Okay.
And then a period just tells it what directory to build it in. So I'm actually not 100% sure that that's necessary. Let's try leaving it out. It may work without it. Nope, it totally requires it. So period says build the container and leave it in this folder.
Yeah, don't put it anywhere else.
Yeah. So and also crucially use the Docker file in this folder too.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see right now it's doing some things, and right now it's actually doing the install step of Neofetch, and you can see the status here. And so it did all of that. It exported. It gave me a warning. We'll talk about this JSON arguments recommended later on. I'll show you what that means. But basically, it's not a crucial warning. It's just saying, hey, we don't recommend something in the way you did it.
Yeah.
So now I want to run the thing I just built.
I have a quick question, which is there's no reason I can think of that you would do this, but if you wanted to, for some reason, you mentioned that this command is saying use the Docker file in this folder. Is it possible to say use the Docker file that's just in a different directory for some reason?
Yep. So in that case, you give it a path instead of the dot. In fact, technically, dot is a path. So dot on Linux means the folder I'm in right now.
Yeah.
You probably know from doing some stuff at the terminal that cd ... will take you up a directory.
Yes.
Like that's a path too. It's just a relative path. So if your Docker file was in the folder above you for some reason,
you would say
give it ...
Neofetch ... Okay.
Yeah. Or you could give it an absolute path and go /home /Taylor /Docker / the name of your
wherever,
file.
yeah.
That is where I was saying that technically I could just type the name of our Docker file there too. But yeah, technically period is a path.
Okay.
In that case. So now we're going to do Docker run. We're going to use the name of the container that we just made, which was Neofetch.
My other question actually
is ran. So
does this container only exist in /Docker, or does it exist in root
it's
also?
Technically everywhere on my system it's available to me. So I said before that it's I was mistaken. I was speaking mistakenly before when I said it build it in this container. That dot is purely telling it what Docker file to reference.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The important thing to note is that we've given it a name. So now Docker has a local index sort of on your machine, in this case on this server, right?
Okay.
Of what containers exist. Now, we're not going to do this today, but I could technically push this because I've given it a name and it works and everything. I could push this to Docker Hub and then other people could run it, just like I ran the Debian container. The way the names work is if a name is not, it's going to look, if I give it a name to run something, it's going to first look, is there something called Neofetch on this machine? And if there's not, it's going to look in the registry for it and download it. So you can even be real confusing. I could even make a container if I hadn't already run Debian on here and call it Debian, and it could be something else.
Okay.
Now, in this case, if I try that, it's going to be like, you already have something called Debian local right now. We've already pulled it down.
Pick a different name.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on top of that, it starts with from Debian. So that's some circular thing I'm sure it wouldn't like either. So we did it. We made technically a Docker container. And all it does is it takes Debian Linux, installs one piece of software, and runs it. That's all it does.
That's all it needs to do.
That's all we need it to do, right? So that is not that impressive on the surface of it, right? But what this does is this, via what we just did, you can run almost any piece of software on almost any machine that runs Docker, right? So again, that can be a different Linux machine. That could be a Linux machine that's running really out-of-date software, right? Like Neofetch is not a great example, but sometimes it's common to have a Linux server that you're using for many things. And this, we run into this all the time on shared hosting. Well, not all the time, but I don't know, a couple times a year at least, where someone says, "Can I run this software on shared hosting? Can you install it?" And we go, "We can't, because that would actually influence what other people are trying to do. And in order to run that software, it would break this other software," right?
Yeah.
This gets
Or-
around that, right?
Yeah. Or there's stuff that we can't put on a shared hosting server for just due diligence reasons, like if you want to run something that uses PHP 5 or something, we can't.
Well, it's a similar,
Mhm.
it's a different reason for the same argument, basically. It's
Yeah.
saying, hey, we're not going to install PHP 5 because it's a security nightmare. And while you may be willing to take that risk for your stuff, us installing it will technically open everyone to that risk.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
We're not willing to do that.
Mhm.
So similar thing. In fact, I have a and this gets,
Shannon also mentioned in the chat that that's what the
Yes.
site archiving tool you built is. It's a collection of different programs that are pulled together into Docker to run all together.
that's a perfect insight, and I wish I would have used when I was building my notes for this stream.
Oh, I thought we were okay.
We actually weren't building to that, but that's perfect.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is a couple rungs down the ladder of complexity, but one of the reasons that I built this in this way is, hey, there's some great archiving software out there that exists. It only runs on Linux though, and I want to make it easy to run on Reclaim Cloud with like commands that I find
More
easy
intuitive.
to remember,
Yeah.
basically. And that's where these scripts come, this archive.sh. That's not Docker. That's just a shell script. And then I have a Windows alternative. I wanted this to work on Windows. I will say I don't run it on Windows myself a lot, but it was important to me that at least the bare minimum worked there. And then, but what it does is none of the actual important stuff is happening in this shell script. Basically, what this does is it gets your command and then it runs everything else in Docker. And the reason it does that in Docker is because then I can tell people, if your system runs Docker,
Just do it
these
in Docker.
Linux-only tools will work.
Okay.
Whether you're on Mac OS, Windows, or Linux. And so my script is basically just a little thing that lets you run stuff in Docker without having to know anything about Docker, basically. So
Can you show what that looks like?
I can, but
You don't have to go through all the
It
commands. I
gets
just
really
want to see.
complicated, and this is honestly like this example is a little bit complex because, but you can see here. Hey, look, there's our Docker build commands, right?
Okay,
They're a
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit different. But in this case, I'm saying run this file resources
Give it a
dockerfile.webrecorder.
path.
This gets to your example of can they be called something else? In my case, the file is called dockerfile.webrecorder.
Yeah.
And give it a tag so that we can run it later. And then later on, here's the run command. And it's a big, long, complicated run command, but it is still a run command. And if we go into resources folder, these are the Docker files. And in my case, you can see how simple they are. So here, this is, I really should have used this as the example. I'm kind of mad now, but thank you, Shannon. This is a good
Sequel.
insight.
This is the sequel. We'll do this next month.
Yeah. But these are, for HT-Track is a great example. HT-Track is, if you go to their website, I've had people say, well, HT-Track isn't updated anymore because the latest version listed here is from 2017. It's not actually true. I don't know why they don't update their website. But if you go and look in the Debian repositories, which is the packages that we can install from APT, there are newer versions there. So I think the author of this probably uses Debian and probably packages it for Debian or works with somebody who does. And so I found that if you want to use HT-Track, you kind of have to use Debian Linux because that's the latest version where it's available, basically.
Okay.
So what does my Docker file do? It says run the latest version of Debian, run our apt update, run our apt HT-Track command, install it. Also, I need the zip command, so we're going to run that too. Then it copies a couple files in, which just it makes them available inside the container to do stuff with later. So this gets into a couple commands that are similar to what we'll do a little bit here, but this is the whole thing. You'll notice there is no CMD command, which is to say there is no default command it's going to run. When you run this container, it's going to go, cool, what do you want to do? It's not going to do anything by default. And that's because of the way that this works. I have my archiving script telling it what to do each time. So I'm telling it, run the terminal, then run this web recorder script that I wrote, then give it these arguments, which are just sort of the URL you want it to crawl, the domain, which is obviously just the domain part of the URL, and then now, which is just the time.
Yeah.
So
you can get your timestamps and stuff.
Yeah. I could have done this and this probably inside of that script, but this is how I chose to do it because I'm not, I don't know. It's, you could argue it's good or bad. I'm not sure. So anyway, but yeah, that is the core fundamental reason. Other things you can do with Docker, and we're going to do a more complex demonstration at the end of the stream here, but that's sort of between what we just did before and all of these really complicated things we're talking about. And you could do something like run a super old version of WordPress. And I'm looking at the wrong blog post here.
I was thinking there's that version.
And this is using Docker Compose, so it's a little bit different language, right? But more to demonstrate that using the same underlying technology, I can run
WordPress 3.9.
And the way this connects to Compose is when it says run this image and then run the 3.9 tag, that is because someone at some point made a Docker file and gave it the -t, the tag name of WordPress 3.9, right?
Okay.
And then uploaded it to Docker Hub. So if I looked, I could find the Docker file that created this at some point. Okay, so going from something that's kind of like demonstrative but not that useful, I keep highlighting this, and there's something weird with my browser where on Reclaim Cloud it will never like remove those highlights, so I gotta keep getting out of here. I gotta break that habit / figure out what's doing that. But what we did before, not that useful, but demonstrates kind of the fundamentals of this. Let's do something a little bit more useful. So we're going to actually make a different Docker file where we have it copy in some text and then do something with that text. And then we'll do one more example, and I promise they both won't take that long. So the next one we're going to do, so I'm going to edit my Docker file again. Actually, we need a text file to work with first. So let me make a new text file. We'll call it tests.txt. We're going to get some generic garbage to put in there. My favorite is Hipsum. Hipster is Ipsum. Artisanal filler text.
Oh, boy.
So we'll paste that in. And I'll write that out. So that's now in a file called test.txt. And we're going to edit our Docker file. We'll still use Debian. That's fine. But I actually don't need for this to install any software because I'm pretty sure it's built in. All we're going to have it do right now is just like echo the read the file.
Yeah, print it out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Again, just to demonstrate, like, you know, this is a way to interact with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to do this now. I got to build up my file, right? But it's not going to work. I'll tell you that. Ipsum. And that's because when it's going to, so it built out the file, but I believe if I run it, it's not going to work. It's going to say no such file or directory. That's because the file does not exist inside the container. It exists here outside the container, right? So we need to get it inside the container so we can do anything with it.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of ways to do this, and the run command and Docker Compose can actually, you can do things like map a folder and say, put this folder that's on the outside part inside the container so that they're the same. So it's kind of like a symlink if you're familiar with symlinks. But for Docker files, we have something even sort of simpler in concept, which is just a command that says copy the file in, please. So I'm going to do that. I'm actually going to go to our reference page that I have the wrong URL for.
Changed it.
There
Okay,
we go.
there you go.
And we'll reference here. It says, hey, add or local or remote files or directories. Great. Add sounds great. So all we have to do is use the add command, give it a source and a destination. So I'm going to do add because we need to add the file before we can cat it, right, to write it out or read it. So I'm going to add, was it test.txt? Yeah.
Yeah, that was what it was.
That the source is on the left and on the right, we're going to put the destination. Let's put it at like some place that's nice, I guess, so that we know where it is. Maybe we have a whole application we're building. We need to know where all the files are. So let's call it / I don't know, files, and then test.txt. It really doesn't matter. And the cool thing about the add command is it's going to make that work, basically. So then we need to write... Sorry, yeah?
And it's going to look around outside to look for test.txt?
This works because this is also a relative path, right? So this is in the same folder as the Docker file. So if I give it the name, it's going to find it. If it wasn't in the same folder, then I would need to give it a path like, wherever this is, test.txt.
And if it
this is
just
using the same path conventions as elsewhere on the command line, which again is not something we talked about, but gets into that sort of prerequisite land of like paths at the command line are a little tricky if you don't know about them,
And if there just wasn't, like, if you'd pulled this from somewhere else and you just didn't have a test.txt.
I need to have one here, right? So
yeah.
If it didn't exist yet, we'd have to make it like we just did or download it, which we actually can't. Shouldn't say can't. I don't know how to do in a Docker file. So let's say if you're saying, let's make a Docker container, but download files into it from the internet, there's better and different ways to do that than using add. And I'll actually demonstrate one in a little bit. So
I mean, that could be a SQL. Let's not.
It's actually part of my final
it is?
example.
Perfect.
Yeah. So
cool.
So anyway, we're going to add this file that already exists in the same folder called test.txt and put it in files /test.txt. Then we changed the cat command to read that because that's where it exists, right? So let's write this and let's build it. So I'm going to call this, what was it, Hipsum?
Hipsum,
I think this will overwrite it. So that should, I forgot to put my period at the end. Great. And so the one thing is kind of interesting too is when you do these build commands, they take some time sometimes, but Docker's pretty smart about knowing what it's done before and what it can skip. So you can see here, transferring context, cached 1.2 from Docker Debian. It's saying, I already have Debian local. I don't need to do that again. But then 2.2, it says, add this file. And it didn't cache that because it's new. That's a new step for it. So now I'm going to run Hipsum. There we go.
And
there's a file.
Oh, yeah.
So these are all examples of how to interact with Docker files. Unfortunately, this is all stuff that is way simpler to do by just typing the commands in, right? Like we're already on a Linux system. We can do things like install a single piece of software, although we talked about maybe reasons why you wouldn't want to, or read out a text file. Like every system you'll ever encounter probably has cat installed. So let's do something else. But we have most of the building blocks in place. So here is an example of a Docker file. This is maybe one of the first Docker files that really did much for me, other than my site archiving toolkit, I guess. And this is a Docker file that runs the MathJax microservice inside of Docker for use with Pressbooks. We're not going to have time to demonstrate what this actually does, but for all intents and purposes, this runs a single little Node program, Node.js. So it doesn't run on shared hosting or cPanel at all. It needs to run on its own. And it's basically a service that runs an API. So you can visit it, and all it's going to really say is, hey, it's working, welcome. But Pressbooks will talk to it, send it API commands, and it will come back with MathJax formatted images, basically, which is really kind of cool. The problem with running this normally, it's not documented in a way that I understood it, basically. So I didn't make this service, to be clear. I just made a Docker wrapper around it.
I remember that this was a thing a while back of you sort of wrestling with how to make this work.
Yeah.
And the end result was, if we run it in Docker, we can make it work.
Yeah, and so, and part of the problem is it runs on their GitHub where they have it documented. It says you run this version of Node. And it's like a really old version of Node, and I'm sure it runs on newer. In fact, I know it runs on newer versions of Node, but that can be kind of hard to grapple with because it's not super straightforward to swap out versions of Node in the way it is to do that with PHP on cPanel. So it was just a little bit tricky. So I ramped this in Docker to make it easier. So here's the Docker file, and this is the core of what's happening. In this case, we're starting from a container called Node. So the Node container is itself built off something else, right? So we know that we've been building off of Debian. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not 100% sure what this Node container is built off of. I bet it's Debian, actually, but it could be something else. My internet is very slow today for some reason.
It's loading fine for me. Or your screen share is okay.
Okay. So this basically is a container where Node is already installed, and they actually offer this in many different formats. So you can run it. Oh yeah, it is Debian, because Bookworm is the release of Debian that exists. Basically, these are all variations on a similar thing. But what we want is, hey, I don't want to have to worry about how to install Node. Just give me Node already installed inside of some Linux container. The fact that I didn't know what it was running under is great, because I don't have to worry about it, right? And so I said, start from Node. I picked a particular version, which is LTS, which just means long-term support version. And Alpine Linux is a distribution that is famous for using very little RAM. So I picked that one because I was like, I want this to use as little resources as possible, and I'm not going to ask much of it, basically. Then we're going to go through this. Some of these are commands we've used, some of them we haven't used. So you're going to tell me what you think these do.
Okay. Workdir changes your working directory from home to app.
Yep, /app. And basically this is kind of like CD, sort of.
Yep. Run, you're giving it a command. I don't know what APK stands for, but presumably you are installing.
Here. You're not going to know all of these. So
yeah, you're installing
APK, Git. APK is Alpine's version of APT.
Oh,
so
okay.
this installs software, and add says install something. And Git is the software we're installing. So Git wasn't there, but I needed Git for something later. So then
Run.
I use it
now
immediately.
You have Git. You use Git to copy in the Pressbooks' MathJax page.
Yes. And if we go there, that's the repository for this tool that I want to use. And you can see here they make it available, but it hasn't seen updates in a long time because it probably doesn't need updates, honestly.
This is one of those things that if you build it right, it's not going to be dependent on anything that anyone would ever touch.
Yeah, and their recommendations are to run this in some old version of Node 10. This is ancient. Like, don't install Node 10 on your machine. They say deploy to production. They give you less detail because they assume you know something about Node. Or run it in AWS Lambda, which is sort of like a custom AWS serverless thing that is probably how they do it, honestly. Anyway, I said none of those are good for me because I'm not going to use AWS. I don't know what PM2. I don't know how to operate. I don't know enough about the Node ecosystem. So I'm just going to do what it says. And I'll tell you, when I first made this, I put in Node:10 And that worked. And then I did through trial and error said, what future versions of Node do they work? And the answer was, yep.
It's fine.
So
All good.
the cool thing was to test that out. All I had to do was change this one thing and then try it again. Right. I didn't have to like install a new server. Right.
Right. Because Docker will just fix
It'll
it up for
just
you.
swap it out. Right.
Okay.
So I'm
Picking
cloning
up.
this Git repository. This gets to one way that we can install stuff.
I was
from
going
the
to
internet.
ask later, like, how do you get in things from Git? Because that was something that the thing that I was trying to do was what I said earlier. Like, the last time I tried to do it, I tried to install something and then it ran. I tried to run it over the weekend and then it crashed and said, I got rid of all your stuff because I didn't know what to do with it. So, and that was because I had not, I think, brought this in correctly. So you run.
Yeah, and there's downsides though. Keep in mind that this means every single time you start up Docker, it's going to download this Git repository.
And
So
if the Git repository is not there anymore, it doesn't know what
it's
to
not
do.
going to work, right?
Okay.
So that's where maybe mapping a folder can be useful, right? But for my purposes, I do want it to do like I like the idea of like no. Every single time this starts up, just get whatever the latest version of this stuff is and try to run it.
Okay.
Then
Clone
we
it
run
into-
npm install,
Yes.
which that just installs whatever dependencies are listed in this Git repository. That's a node thing. And then finally expose. This one's a little bit weird. So
The port.
yeah, it's saying so Docker technically also runs its own networking that's isolated. And so we have to tell Docker, hey, open up 3000 so that other stuff can access it. That's the port that the Pressbooks folks have this run on by default. And instead of changing that, I just said, yeah, sure, let's use 3000, And then finally command, this is a little bit different format, but it's the same thing. It's running npm start. Docker, for reasons, recommends you write this in a different notation. That's what this is.
Okay.
Whereas before we were just doing the same notation as you type it at terminal. This is really the same thing. It's just with quotes around it, basically. So this is kind of an example of this is kind of simple, but you can see how, okay, with this recipe, doing mostly things we already knew how to do, which was like run commands in Docker files and use the from command. You always need to start with a from. We can run a totally different piece of software that is otherwise not available to us on, say, Alma Linux, or it might work on Alma Linux, but and in this one thing, I can run it. Now, where this gets more complicated is I then do some stuff in Compose to make sure like other containers can proxy and do let's encrypt certificates. That's really way out of scope for today. But my point is to show the real thing that I learned when putting this together was, oh, my Docker file can make this all one step for me once I write it, of course. So we're not going to actually do this, to be clear. There is if you want to run this, like there's some instructions, but this is what my example Docker file that's kind of simple that you can sort of see where we started and where you could get to. And this is even, there are really complicated Docker files out there too that are above me and doing crazy things, but this is where you would go with it eventually.
Nice.
So hopefully this was like at least somewhat useful to see how people do things in Docker and why they do it that way. And it's something I want to build on. Like I would love to build on this resource and maybe do some more complicated things. But this is a little bit explaining of kind of why Docker works the way it does. Because it wasn't immediately obvious to me why you would ever want it to say throw away all of your files every single time. And it's like, no, that's a feature, not a bug, technically. So
they're doing that on purpose.
With that, I think we're gonna stop about 5 minutes early because I know, Pilot, you got to leave pretty soon.
I have a meeting.
So thanks everyone for watching, and stay tuned. I think we'll do more stuff like this in the future if people like this. I like the idea of being able to collate some resources on learning Docker based on stuff we do on Reclaim TV. So I don't think this will be the last time we do something like this. And see you all next time.
See you next time. Bye.